At 0500 hours and 5 minutes local time, inside the crowded tanker anchorages of the Persian Gulf, a lone destroyer of the United States Navy is threading the darkness at 30 knots with every radar and radio switched off, racing toward a firing point 55 miles off the Iranian coast. Locked in her launch cells are 8 Tomahawk cruise missiles, each one assigned to Darkhovin, the construction site where Iran is trying to restart its nuclear weapons program. If the Iranians detect either the ship or the missiles she carries, this single chance to cripple Iran's next reactor could be lost for good. On the bridge, the officer of the deck is conning 9,000 tons of steel through the anchorage, using nothing but bearing drift, binoculars, and raw nerve. Loaded tankers sit at anchor across miles of black water, waiting their turn through the Strait. Small local dhows cut between them with no schedule and no running lights. One radar sweep would make this passage simple. One radar sweep is also the one thing she cannot allow herself. Iranian listening posts ring this gulf, and they don't need to see a warship to find one. First, they only need her to speak, even once. Spread across the chart table, Iran's known coastal radars are marked as red fans spilling off the shoreline, and her course threads the narrow seams between them. Where a fan can't be avoided, she hides in the crowd, one more hull lost in a river of hulls. She is running toward a launch box, a patch of ocean plotted weeks earlier by a planning cell 7,000 miles away. Every Tomahawk's route begins at a first fixed waypoint, a point each missile must reach before the rest of its path even makes sense. 8 missiles, 8 separate routes, 8 first waypoints, and this narrow stretch of water is the only place on the planet within reach of all 8 at once. She has 4 minutes to get there. At 0509 minutes, she crosses the line marked on her navigator's chart and eases the throttles back to a lazy 8 knots, circling. To any satellite that happens to be watching, she looks like a retiree out trolling for fish. At 0512 minutes, a square hatch on the forward deck blows open. The first missile climbs out on a column of white fire, the roar arriving half a second behind it, a flat shove you'd feel in your chest before your ears even caught up. The missile pitches over, its wings snap out, the turbofan lights, and it drops away toward the wavetops. 7 more follow in the same rhythm. Hatch, flame, pitch, wings, drop. 2 minutes later, the deck stands empty, and somewhere below, sailors are already arguing about what they want for breakfast. 200 miles south, aboard the flagship's Combat Information Center, a strike controller watches 8 fresh tracks bloom across his display and starts a 30-minute countdown. The 8 missiles settle onto the wave tops and fan apart, their spent booster casings tumbling into the Gulf behind them. 2 run north. 2 swing wide to the south, 2 hold the center line, the last pair banks west, away from everything toward nothing anyone briefed. On the bridge wing, an officer watches the last exhaust plume flatten and vanish. 8 booster flames in 2 minutes have just marked the ship's position for every camera and coastal battery on that shore. An hour of careful silence spent in 2 minutes of fire. 55 miles offshore is closer than any captain wants to hold a destroyer, well inside range of Iran's coastal anti-ship batteries, and he's known that the entire run-in. Now the ship swings toward open water at flank speed. Somewhere up that coastline, anti-ship crews are working the very same math from the opposite side, and the next hour belongs entirely to the throttles. Half an hour from impact, whether this ends at a shattered reactor foundation or scattered across a floodplain, now rests with 8 small turbofan engines. And across the horizon, the watching has already begun. Inside the Ghadir radar site, a crew barely 4 minutes into the morning shift inherits a sky that has just changed. Returns bloom out of the northern Gulf. That corner of the scope had read empty all week. The operator leans closer. The smears refuse to sharpen, big, slow, blooming, drifting west like weather that's moving the wrong direction. Within a minute, the lead controller is on the Revolutionary Guard's radio net. Raid inbound, bearing 090, count uncertain. The Ghadir array is more than 100 antenna masts arranged in a ring, Iran's over-the-horizon early warning radar. It bounces long wavelength signals off the upper atmosphere and reads whatever comes back. A ground station near the border can spot aircraft out to 370 miles and ballistic launches at nearly 700, well past the curve of the Earth. The destroyer had spent an hour dodging every radar that transmits. The one system that just caught her handiwork is the one that only listens. But that atmospheric bounce smears every return it gets. What Ghadir hands its operators is a warning measured in tens of miles, never a track precise enough for a missile to fly against. It's like hearing thunder from a storm still below the horizon. You know it's coming, and roughly from where, but nobody can tell you where the lightning will land. Every actual shot still has to come from a battery with its own line-of-sight radar. The nearest one is already spinning up. 21 miles inland, the lead pair crosses the coastline and climbs just enough to hold clearance. Below the water towers, above the date palms, wingtips shadowing the irrigation ditches 160 feet over the Khuzestan floodplain. On a levee south of the coast road, a farmer feels the ground shiver before his ears register the engines. Two gray shapes vanish behind the palms before he can finish turning his head. Meanwhile, the western pair peels off toward the Iraqi border, 40 degrees off any bearing to the actual target. The Tomahawk's whole trick is a trade. It gives up speed for a very particular kind of invisibility. Over water, it hugs the wave tops under 50 feet. Over land, it cruises between 100 and 160 feet. Down there, the curve of the planet itself stands between the missile and every ground radar in the province. Picture a man crawling across a mile-wide pasture flat on his belly. The farmhouse porch never sees him until he's at the fence. The trouble with crawling past this particular farmhouse is that it keeps a gun on the roof. At Avaz, atop a truck-mounted mast, the radar that actually guides the shots climbs to full power. The long-range battery there, cued straight off Ghadir's warning, locks its sector onto the inbound arc, beam pressed flat against the horizon, hunting. The instant the lead pair crests its line of sight, the crew fires. Two interceptors punch free of their canisters on cold launch charges, tip over onto the threat bearing, and ignite midair in bursts of orange flame. Look at the top of that mast, a flat, square array. The radar NATO calls Tombstone. It's the guidance heart of the S-300 PMU-2, Iran's longest-range Russian-built air defense system, firing 48 N-6E2 interceptors. A full battery can guide up to 12 rounds against 6 targets simultaneously. Each round closes at better than Mach 6 behind a 180-kilogram fragmentation warhead, nearly 400 pounds of steel and explosive. But the interceptor is half-blind by design. It homes on radar energy the Tombstone paints onto the target, and that beam has to stay locked unbroken from launch to impact. Its flashlight tag, the interceptor only sees what the ground crew keeps lit, and the moment that beam loses the runner, the interceptor goes blind. Both rounds go supersonic within 2 seconds, closing on a target the Tombstone can only hold for barely 3. The first interceptor detonates 260 feet high behind the lead missile's wake. The second buries its fragments in an irrigation levee. The lead Tomahawk flies straight through the falling dirt and holds course. Avaz had every reason to expect a hit and nothing to show for it, and the reason is geometry, not marksmanship. That Tombstone radar sits 80 feet up on a lattice mast, hunting a target flying at 160. A radar that low and a target that low can only see each other out to about 28 miles. Beyond that, the Earth's own curve gets physically in the way. You could double the transmitter's power and not buy back a single foot. You can be the best gun crew in Iran and still lose to a planet that curves. The 200-kilometer range printed on the spec sheet only exists against something flying at altitude. 28 miles at Tomahawk speed is a 3-minute window, and reaction time eats the front of it. The route planners had drawn these paths to cross this battery's arc rather than fly straight at it. The Tombstone spent its entire engagement walking its beam through ground clutter behind a fast-crossing target, firing deflection lead on a bird skimming the grass. The Avaz crew did everything by the book and bought Iran 2 craters in a wheat field. By now, all 4 pairs are through the coastal defense belt, and the province tries something different, something that doesn't shoot at the missiles at all. At Khuzestan Air Defense Sector Headquarters, the sector commander watches 4 separate low tracks appear and vanish across the plot. Each battery's radar can hold a Tomahawk for less than a minute before the horizon swallows it again. The raid is 12 minutes from impact. Every officer in that room knows it, and every one of them is watching him for the call. On the plot, the western pair still makes no sense. 2 missiles driving hard for the Iraqi border, 40 degrees off any line to the actual site. One officer argues decoys, another insists it's an Iranian-backed militia headquarters in Basra, a second target nobody briefed. The commander lets them argue and keeps his eyes on the other 6. The argument is still running when the next problem lands on him. Each battery only holds its target within that same 28-mile window that beat Avaz. At this speed, roughly 60 seconds wide. 4 radars, each holding the baton for about a minute, and the handoff keeps dropping. The command post is trying to weld one continuous track out of 4 flickering fragments, and every weld costs time it doesn't have. No continuous track means no shot, so the commander keeps chasing bearings, searching for the one switch that covers the whole province at once. Jammer trucks across Khuzestan light off. High-powered transmitters throw a wall of noise across the GPS band, and inside the missiles, the satellite fix begins to rot. The trucks doing it look like nothing much, masts and rotating dishes clustered around a single job, bearing the faintest signal the entire province depends on. A GPS signal arrives from a satellite 12,000 miles up at a power below the natural background noise, fainter than static. A receiver only finds it because it knows exactly which code to listen for. A ground jammer doesn't need to be clever, only close and loud. A few hundred watts from a single truck can outshout a satellite across an entire province. It's like trying to hear someone speak through a phone across a packed stadium while the whole crowd is roaring. The phone hasn't stopped talking, it's simply stopped mattering. If this raid were navigating purely by GPS, the province would have just won the morning. But the switch comes with its own bill. Every airliner over southern Iran loses its GPS too, and air traffic control around Avaz goes back to paper strips. The province is blinding itself just to save one construction site. One by one, all 8 Tomahawks flag their satellite fix as garbage, and not one of them wobbles. 20 seconds after the jammers light off, the lead pair sweeps a canal cut, takes a fix off the ground itself, and presses on. Under the missile's belly sits a flush radar altimeter window no bigger than a coffee cup. That's how the airframe finds its way without ever asking the sky for permission. Inside the fuselage, a ring laser gyroscope and 3 accelerometers keep a running tally of every turn and climb since it left the deck. Nothing comes from outside. There's nothing left to jam. Left alone, that inertial picture drifts about a mile for every hour of flight, enough to miss Darkhovin by half a mile. So every 15 to 30 miles, the belly altimeter sweeps a strip of terrain, measures elevation to within about a foot, matches it against a contour map loaded before launch, and snaps the drift back to 0. 40 miles south, the battery that's been living off Gadir's cues doesn't need GPS either. That canal cut wasn't chosen by accident. The terrain matcher needs roughly 50 feet of rise and fall to lock on, and much of the Khuzestan floodplain sits under 10. Every stretch of ground looks like every other stretch. So each checkpoint sits deliberately on a levee, a riverbank, or a rise toward the Iraqi border, a few feet of man-made edge giving the altimeter something to grip. The men who drew these routes had studied an enemy province's elevation charts more closely than the farmers who actually live on that ground. 20 minutes into the jamming, the tracks on the sector commander's plot haven't wavered by a single degree. He's burning megawatts against missiles that stopped listening to the sky before he even finished his first order, and he has no way of knowing it. Somewhere in Tehran, this morning has just become somebody's problem. A missile design that dates back decades has just ignored the country's entire electronic warfare budget simply by hugging the dirt. And in a budget office back in Washington, a 40-year-old line item just quietly justified its own existence all over again. On the highway out of Avaz, the day shift buses for the Darkhovin site pull away from the depot right on schedule. 40 minutes of road between the depot and the fence, and nobody has told the workers a thing. 200 miles south, the strike controller reads 8 incoming data bursts every few seconds. Position, fuel remaining, engine speed, each missile reporting in like a runner calling out from mile markers. Look at the low dome fared into the missile's spine and you'll see why. That dome is a satellite antenna, and it works both ways. The missile itself decides nothing. A new instruction can be typed aboard the flagship and pushed to the airframe in under a minute, shifting the aim point, the run-in bearing, even the arrival second. What it can't change is the warhead it left with or the fuel already burned. It's a marathon runner phoning home at every mile marker. You can hand him a different finish line as long as his legs can still reach it. The doctrine has a name: human on the loop. If Tehran announced civilians were on site, any of these 8 missiles could still be pulled off target with only minutes to spare. Right now, the controller's attention is fixed somewhere else entirely. The day shift buses left Avaz 11 minutes ago, 40 minutes of road still ahead of them, and the missiles arrive in 7. The margin holds, and barely, and his hand stays off the console. Nobody calls it off. One has to wonder, watching a moment like that unfold, what it must feel like to be the one person whose entire job is watching a clock against a busload of strangers who have no idea their morning commute is being timed against a war they don't even know is happening. 7 minutes out, the 4 attack headings begin curving toward the same square mile of ground, their paths crossing the arc of one more waiting battery. On the flagship's threat display, the Avaz S-300 burns bright, its position refreshed with every sweep. The Bavar battery south of it reads 3 days stale. The battery that already fired is no longer the problem. The one that hasn't fired yet is. South of Avaz, a flat radar panel tilts upright on its truck bed, aimed at the gap where the eastern pair has to appear. In the command cab, the battery commander has heard it all over the net. Avaz shot and missed. He has the one thing Avaz never had: time. The 2 missiles bending into his corridor are the only 2 he can see, though nobody has told him there are 6 more out there. And he knows exactly what a radiating panel means in this campaign, a return address for the next American anti-radar missile. And he brings it up to full power anyway. It's the air defense equivalent of picking up the phone knowing full well it's a bill collector. His crew answers because their orders don't come with a mute button. The eastern pair crests his horizon. A canister vents. An interceptor streaks skyward on a tail of flame. A Bavair 373, the best long-range air defense system Iran has built on its own. Fielded in 2019. Riding it is a 2-stage Sayyad 4B, the longest reach Iranian air defense owns. The panel steers its beam electronically. This crew isn't searching blind. The network handed them a bearing 10 minutes ago, and the panel has been staring down one narrow corridor ever since, waiting. All that patience for 2 seconds of actual work. A few repeated looks at the same target build a track file in 4 to 6 seconds. The computer calculates where the paths will meet, and the missile does the rest, ejecting vertically, tipping onto bearing, boosting toward the intercept point until its own nose radar wakes for the final seconds. Tehran claims this system can see past 300 kilometers and shoot nearly as far, claims because nobody outside Iran has ever watched it try. Against a target hugging the grass, none of that range matters. The whole engagement has to finish inside the 35 kilometers between horizon and fence line. It's a champion marksman with a world-class rifle, except the range officer only uncovers the target for the final 2 seconds. The interceptor arcs over and comes down the intercept line at the eastern pair. Nose radar now live. The hard part was never the chase, and it's the last half second. The proximity fuse has to fire in the narrow sliver where the fragment cone and the target actually meet, and against a crossing target this low, the fuse reads target return and ground return almost in the same breath. A splash of dirt looks exactly like a target arriving early. It fires a beat too high. The cone of steel blooms above and behind the missile, most of it wasted against open sky. A handful of fragments catch the Tomahawk's left wing. Not a kill, a graze. The missile shudders, corrects, and keeps flying with a bent outboard control surface. The Bavar crew slews for a second shot, 23 rounds still sitting ready across the battery's 6 launchers, but the bearings have already swept past their arc. 7 clean missiles and 1 wounded one, 90 seconds from impact. All 4 pairs are in their final turns now, noses locked north, east, south, and west, converging on the same fence line. The entire plan visible at last in a single picture. The western pair's 20-minute detour toward Iraq has already curled back in. Inside the command post, the argument about Basra just lost. The 8 Tomahawks had left their launch cells over a 2-minute window because a Mark 41 launcher fires 1 cell at a time, never a shotgun blast. So the planning cell had cut each route to match the launch order. Even the shortest path in, the weaving northern run, comes out to roughly 262 route miles. The western dogleg runs about 280. That 18-mile difference at 550 miles an hour works out to almost exactly 2 minutes of flight time. The missile launched first flies the longest path. The one launched last flies the shortest. All 8 are timed to arrive inside the same 5-second window. That's not luck. That's a planning cell solving 8 routes backward from a single second on a clock, the kind of homework only the United States Navy assigns itself and then aces before breakfast. Now run the defender's math instead. A radar beam can slew in a heartbeat, but a fresh track file has to be built from nothing for every new target. And those are exactly the seconds the Bavar battery bought with its earlier silence. 4 bearings, roughly 90 degrees apart, all arriving inside 5 seconds. One radar system physically cannot finish 2 of those fights at once. Reloading a launcher takes half an hour or more, so that clock isn't even on the table. A defender can fight 1 bearing at a time, pivot, track, shoot. 4 at once turns every remaining gun and launcher into a spectator. Aim at 1 and you turn your back on 3. That isn't an engagement anymore. That's a dunk tank. The Navy has a name for exactly this, and it's about as plain as it sounds. Time on target. 4 punches thrown from 4 directions, timed to land as 1. There's no defensive stance built for that. 60 seconds out, the perimeter fence at Darkhovin crests the horizon of 8 seeker heads at once. Here's what's waiting there. A crane line, excavated foundations, a concrete batching plant, a laydown yard stacked with rebar and steel forms. The shape of that target tells you exactly why this was a Navy job and not Obama run. A hardened cavern buried under a mountain calls for a different weapon entirely. A smaller warhead there would only scar the hillside without touching what actually mattered inside. Darkhovin is the opposite problem. Above ground, early in construction, years away from ever holding nuclear fuel. What matters here isn't penetration, it's blast and fragmentation placed with precision against soft industrial equipment. Each Tomahawk carries a 1,000-pound unitary warhead, high explosive packed inside a fragmenting steel case. At ground level, it slams out a blast wave above 20 pounds per square inch out to about 50 feet. enough to fold a tower crane's lattice like a drinking straw, and its steel fragments wreck equipment out past 200 feet. Each missile lands within about 10 meters of its aim point, call it 30 feet, and that's exactly why 8 small warheads beat one giant one here. A 30,000-pound bomb can only be in one place at a time. 8,000-pounders placed meters from 8 separate targets wreck an entire construction schedule, not just a patch of dirt. Nobody rents a pile driver just to tap in a thumbtack. At 0542 minutes local time, the lead Tomahawk buries its warhead into the reactor foundation excavation, and the other impacts arrive within a single second of it. The crane line folds. Dust boils up over the batching plant. The laydown yard turns its own stacked rebar into shrapnel. The shockwave rolls out across the floodplain, and 10 miles up the Avaz Road, the windows of the day shift buses buzz in their frames. In those final seconds, every Tomahawk stops trusting its map and simply looks. A camera in the nose photographs the ground below and slides a stored reference image across the live picture until the pixels line up. However far that picture has to slide is exactly how far off course the missile has drifted, and the autopilot flies that error straight down to 0. No satellite required. The 6th missile's camera finds its aim point and calls for a hard turn left, but the outboard surface damaged by the Bavar's near miss can't produce the roll the autopilot is asking for. The missile banks shallow, turns slow, and runs out of sky before the correction ever finishes. A few meters of error swells to 100 by the time it hits. The seeker knew exactly where to go. The wing simply couldn't take it there. Aboard the flagship, the last data burst arrives and the display finally goes quiet. The strike controller marks the time and stands up. Iranian air defense had fired every shot the laws of physics allowed them, and Iran's newest reactor site had still become a parking lot of rubble by morning. It leaves you wondering, doesn't it, about that one missile that made it all the way through jamming, terrain, and 2 separate missile batteries, only to be undone by a scrap of shrapnel and a few degrees of bent metal. Whether you count that as a mission that succeeded or one that fell just short probably depends less on the physics of the thing and more on where you're sitting when you hear the story told.